Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm Danny Rogers, Editor-in-Chief of PRWeek, and last week we hosted PR360, the huge conference for comms professionals that takes place every May in Brighton. In a special conference session at the end of day one, I talked to the two comms industry legends behind the BBC radio show When It Hits the Fan, which has proved such a hit itself with listeners over the past 2 years. The two presenters are obviously Simon Lewis OBE, who has been Director of Comms for Prime Minister Gordon Brown, Vodafone, British Gas and the Queen, and David Yelland, who now runs consultancy Kitchen Table Partners, but has previously been editor of the Sun newspaper, of course, as well as a senior comms executive at both Weber Shandwick and Brunswick. So in a moment, you can hear our conversation at the PR360 conference. We talk about what they've learned about the PR business, about podcasting, about media, and even about Gary Lineker. So now, I bring you Fan Hitters Live from PR360. Right, so I should introduce two men who need very little introduction, really. BBC's hit show, When It Hits the Fan, has been running for, nearly 2 years now?
70 episodes tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, and it keeps getting renewed.
Yes, so far, so good. Thanks to our wonderful
Unless you know something we don't.
Yeah.
So, of course, we have, on my far left, David Yelland, who's a founder of his own public relations company, Kitchen Table Partners, and he's been doing that for 10 years. Before that, he was at Brunswick LLP, where he was partner for 10 years. And, of course, David was also a former editor of the Sun newspaper, which seems a long time ago, I guess. And Simon Lewis, former troubleshooter for people like the Queen and Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, as well as major corporations like NatWest, Vodafone and British Gas. So together they bring decades of experience in, I've got here, creating crises as well as managing crises. So let's talk a bit about When It Hits the Fan, and why do you think it's proven such a success? It seems to run and gain more and more audience.
Well, we have a brilliant producer, Eve Streeter, who is here, which is a huge part of it. I mean, I think both of us, when we started, weren't sure where it was going, in the sense that the BBC gave us this short commission, which was great. We knew each other a bit, which we can talk about from years ago, and so the kind of chemistry between us was really important. So Eve sat with us, and William Miller, the producer, the overall producer, just hearing us talking to each other, and we gelled. And I think we just wanted to make sure that we could do three things. First of all, get a second commission, because it wasn't guaranteed. Get a decent audience, which I think we have. Hands up, who listens to it regularly? That's not bad. That's half the room, is it? Yeah. And thirdly, the only real concern we had was, would we have enough issues to cover every week? I mean, how many crises can you have? And what's been just extraordinary is every week we have to cut down the list. It's been a real sort of insight into the reality of what we do.
There's a lot to say in answer to that. I mean, one of the things is that, the PR industry is sometimes not very proud of itself. And we talked about, when I was a partner at Brunswick, we had Alan Parker, who runs Brunswick, organising an away weekend where we all went away. And he stood up and said, what are we going to call ourselves? Because it can't be PR. It can't be public relations. Is it consultancy? Are we more McKinsey? Are we more Bain? Are we more Accenture? And I think one of the things we might have just have done is shine a light on the industry. I've had a lot of feedback from people that say, now my mum knows what I do for a living because she listens to the programme. It's an industry we ought to be a little bit more proud of ourselves. So that's not why we did it, but that is one of the many things that's happening.
That's the effect.
Yeah.
Do you get any sense, I know the BBC doesn't share audience figures, any sense of how many people, particularly in this industry, listen to your show regularly?
Well, we constantly debate that because we're both very competitive. And how many people work in the PR industry, would you say?
Nearly 100,000 maybe in the UK?
I mean, our guess is, our figures, and Eve's going to say, don't say this, probably about 80 to 100,000 listeners a week, of whom I guess a large proportion are from the PR industry. But I think what's really interesting about it is it's quite clear that people outside the PR industry are really interested to find out what goes on in PR, which I think is fascinating. And the guy, the big boss at the BBC, said the most important thing you've got to do on this is you've got to lift the bonnet. Lift the bonnet. I think the lifting of the bonnet on what happens in our world has just opened it up to a lot of people who've always wondered what PR actually is. And you've obviously done a great job seriously with PRWeek at one level, but maybe we're just kind of opening it up a bit in terms of a wider audience.
And the news behind the news, I guess. What's really happening behind the news headlines?
I don't think the public necessarily... I think the public are really interested in the middle bit, what I call the marzipan layer between the people that make the decisions, the politicians, the business, the CEOs, in entertainment, people like Beckham and so on, and them. And it is our world. I've spent my entire career in it on one side or the other. And there's a lot, the media is obsessed with itself, so there's a lot of coverage of the media, but not a lot of coverage of our industry, because it's full of people who work basically, my wife, who's a communications director, calls it influencing through stealth. You know, it's not about the communications team, it's about the brand. We've just heard, some amazing stories, RSP being encouraged, just amazing. It's not about the individuals, and that's very different to the media, because in the media it's all about them.
Yeah.
And that's why it's never really been understood. So I think people are interested in that, and there are also things go wrong all the time.
I was about to say, there's a lot of it, and the clue's in the title, isn't it? It's people like to know when it goes wrong, why it goes wrong, and what companies do when they're hit with crises.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the central role that PR often plays in those crises, and in addition to that, how some decisions can be so critical in determining the outcome of a crisis one way or the other.
I mean, one of the many journeys we've gone on, you may have noticed over the episodes, it's 70 tomorrow, that Simon started to talk about his time at the Palace. Because if you spent your life in PR at senior level like Simon has, you don't talk about it. Now, I've spent half my career in the work. I was trained as a journalist. Basically, if you're a tabloid journalist, what you do is you go into a room full of people and you shout, "There's a fire!" Even if there isn't a fire. If you're in our industry, it's the opposite. You know everything, but you say nothing. So I've travelled towards this end, and Simon's travelled the other way. It's interesting how we, and not that you've been indiscreet, but at all. But the degree to which we are in our industry, we know everything but don't say anything, is so different to how I spent 20 years of my life, where I knew nothing but said a lot.
I think we can both draw on, to your point, our respective experiences. So, that very first conversation we had all those years later, after having first met David, having become editor of The Sun in pretty much the same week that I got the job at the Palace, we've kind of seen things through very different prisms, and now here we are looking at them in the same industry, but still with the experience that's very different. I think that kind of helps, maybe, just give people a kind of an additional layer of insight.
I also think some of the things we're doing are actually really, really quite important. I mean, we led last week on what was leaked to the Sunday Times to try and stop the woman who's the lead candidate for the director of MI6 getting the job. And we had a profound effect on that. If she gets the job, I'm not saying it'll be because we didn't, we lanced that spin attempt from people within the security service to stop the first woman being appointed there.
It's real insight into power, isn't it? And into politics and into public life.
Yeah.
I think people enjoy that because often they get all their news just through the prism of mainstream journalism.
Yeah. It's not, I think what we're trying to do is show that this is really important and things happen behind the scenes that affect the outcome. And if we can shine the light on it, like we're doing tomorrow, for example, with Lineker and the BBC a little, we can say stuff that I often think when we do it, we're the only people that are saying this because of our collective experience and also because of the name of the programme,
It brings me on to Mr. Lineker, because I was going to ask you, first of all, how do you decide what you can and cannot talk about? Bearing in mind it's a BBC show, and you, like Gary Lineker, in that sense, work for the BBC. So first of all, how do you decide what you can say and how you can tackle subjects? And secondly, I want you to tell me what you think about Gary Lineker.
The process is really quite rigorous. We have a script. The script will go tonight, Eve, I think, to a great guy called Roger. We call him Roger the Dodge, who is the compliance officer in the BBC. And he reads the script, which is quite right. And if there's anything in the script that he thinks is going to put us, the BBC, into a difficult position, he tells us. And sometimes it's overnight. Sometimes, he's brilliant. He comes back literally before we start recording. So we've got a kind of mechanism inbuilt to make sure. But I think the really interesting thing is I can't think, David, of a single occasion when the BBC has effectively said, you know what, we prefer you to steer away from this. And tomorrow's a very good example. The Gary Lineker issue is very tricky for the BBC, but no one has ever said to us in any terms at all, you know what, we'd prefer if you didn't do this week. Sometimes we had clues as to we'd really like you to do this story this week because we think there's a lot of interest in it. But that's very different from saying, you know what, can you steer away? Even Palace stuff. I mean, Palace stuff, Number 10, the BBC itself. I think we've been given a pretty free rein, actually.
Having spent 20 years working for Rupert Murdoch, where I was very much told what I couldn't do. The BBC is slightly chaotic, but it's a wonderful organisation. It underpins so much of what this country stands for. I really very much believe that. Of course, it's not perfect. I mean, and Roger, by the way, his role, I don't forget the title, but it is compliance for the whole of Radio 4. So he does the Archers, he does everything. And it's more a case of, we had a very difficult episode. We decided to do an episode about Prince Harry's settlement with News International, which obviously included the years I was editor of The Sun. And we faced right into that, very proud of the episode we did, and where Simon asked me questions. And I think we broke some new ground there because people in that industry, the newspaper industry, never talk. They put everybody else to account, but they never talk about themselves. And I find that. So that's an example of where compliance had to make sure that there's legal issues. You're dealing with Prince Harry, and it's never easy. That's quite big stuff because it is the BBC. Gary Lineker, if you ask about Gary Lineker, I guess the trite answer is you have to listen. But he clearly made a mistake. It's an example. When you repost, you have to be very, very. You have to take a beat. He reposted an anti-Semitic post because probably hadn't put his glasses on. It's probably the reality. He probably retweeted, I think it was early in the morning, and he retweeted, that could happen to me, that could happen to any of us. Now, the bigger issue is the arc of his career from first talking about asylum seekers and attacking Cyrilla Braverman, saying England feels like 1930s Germany. The really interesting question to me is whether his reputation is high now if he'd never kept out. Personally, my personal view is I think he's very brave, and I'm a fan. That's just my personal view. That won't necessarily come over tomorrow. It may do. It'll be up to Eve whether it gets in or not. But it's one of the great things about the BBC is we do express personal views, but we have to be careful about them.
Simon, Gary Lineker.
Great footballer, I have to say. Great TV presenter, absolutely entitled to his own strongly held views. I sometimes think our programme is a bit like looking in a rear-view mirror. My view is this was an accident waiting to happen. It was getting to a stage where the BBC and Gary Lineker were going to part company. It just needed something that triggered it. And so that's I think the fascinating thing about our programme, that you just see these things, you think, what, that was bound to happen. And the most important thing in PR terms is when those things do happen, that both parties can walk away with kind of honour preserved, and I think that's what's happened. I find the slow motion nature of crises fascinating because they are actually often in slow motion. I think that's what's happened here. He was definitely played for the wrong clubs, by the way, just for the record.
Absolutely not a Chelsea fan. But he was pushing his luck, wasn't he? I mean, because he already had this huge audience. He already had his dream job, which was Match the Day, and it was this. And yet he pushed his luck on his political viewpoints, which we knew were quite divisive. So, was it the right move for him?
Well, I mean, we sort of need people in the world that push their luck, is my point, and we don't have enough of them. And the problem is, one of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow is, and it's very relevant to everybody here, is why. I mean, we're not going to talk about Gaza as an issue because we're a podcast about PR, but in a sense, the thing to talk about is not that Gary Lineker speaks out on things; it's that so few people do, including companies. If we move away from that incredibly contentious issue just for a moment to say Brexit or Trump, there's a piece in Stuart Kirk in the FT writing about why is US corporates, why are they saying nothing about tariffs? And I, having been in those rooms many times, when you've had 20 years in the newspapers and 20 years on this side, you sort of get, and we're all getting a bit older, and can say what I like, really. And I think that the lack of courage of powerful people in the world, whether they be in business or entertainment, of not saying stuff about stuff is awful. And I think our industry often advises people. That's exactly. I was watching Tom Fletcher, the UN. I mean, I'll go back to Gaza now, but think, really, what does it take for people to say stuff? So, I know there's two sides of every argument, but I think that let's take Brexit. If I had £1 for every CEO who said to me, "Oh, it was, what a disaster," and I say to them, "Well, why didn't you say anything?" "Oh no, we don't want to get involved in politics." Well, and maybe that's right. But the great thing about fan hitters is we can talk about this issue, and I think it's it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. And I think maybe Gary Lineker's got something to teach the rest of us, but you've got to be careful what you retweet.
Is that realistic, Simon, in the corporate world?
I think companies have become much more cautious. I think things like Brexit did really concern companies because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the argument. I take David's point completely, but the fact is, I knew it because I was doing a job at the time at the heart of Brexit. It was obvious that companies were petrified, and look what happened to the CBI. Secondly, there are always consequences of being controversial, which is obviously what Gary Lineker has found, and companies shy away from controversy. And I think what the last few years with the populism as well that we're seeing has thrown is just a sense of, you know what, when in doubt, back off.
Undoubtedly right. And of course, I have given advice exactly the same as Simon has when I was at Brunswick many times, not to say anything. Because I was in the newspaper industry for so long, and I edited The Sun and the New York Post as well, I know that people go on target lists. You have a target list. And Gary Lineker's on the Sun target list. So when he took that decision to go political, that was brave, not because he might lose his job, but because he had a crowd of reporters outside his house, and his kids were followed to school, and all the rest of it. It's much easier to take the money and not say anything.
Very true. So I'm going to let the audience think about some questions they'd like to ask you. But just while people are thinking about questions, what do you think your series has done in terms of helping the public or the business world in general understand what comms professionals do and recognise it more?
Well, I like to think that we have lifted the bonnet, and it is important. I think a lot more people now know what PR is and isn't, and to be frank, also the sides of PR that we're not particularly proud of. I mean, that story about leaking doesn't reflect very well on the world of PR, but it happens. So I think we've done people a service. I think the other thing, and I feel quite strongly about this, because I was years and years ago a graduate who went into PR when it was very rare. In fact, most people tried and failed something else before going into PR. I think people understand it's an important skill, it's an important discipline. It's not a profession, but it matters. And I think if we've done anything, we've kind of given a sense to people who listen to the programme, this is an important discipline, and when it goes well, it can make a very positive impact to businesses, to people, to organisations, but it can also be used, as lots of activities are, in a way that isn't so pleasant, but it is what it is.
I love shining a light on things that the media don't do very well. For example, the importance of China. We've done a lot on Chinese companies, both in terms of vaping, but also in tech, Chinese tech. I think there are areas where we can be better. I was thinking just a few minutes ago, listening to that really impressive panel about the Curry's ads and how that's got through, that we need to get better on digital. And we try, despite the fact we're of an age. We do, every week we have a digital item. We've got another one tomorrow. So it's not as if we don't do it, but actually I think we might do an episode on
TikTok.
On what, we've done TikTok as a company, but, so many people in this room will be spending their lives in digital channels, not in, and the creativity around that is really interesting. And creating value through creativity like Curry's have done so well, and others, is something that we need to get better at, because the audience are interested in that.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any questions in the audience?
My question tied on to the point you were making around digital. I think there's a lot of reports out there showing young people are turning off from news or actively avoiding news. What do you think is the future of how our industry and the people in the room reach young people and make an impact?
I think very positive. I think the future is good. I was just talking to my son in the car on the way down. He wasn't in the car, he was calling me. He's in mid-20s. Look, channels change, people get news different ways, they get information different ways, and AI is going to make a massive difference, but people will still communicate with each other, and it'll still be important what the reputations of all the organisations we work, and so it'll continue as it is, and it has transformed tremendously during our career, hasn't it? But in
Absolutely.
a way, the same thing. Everything changes, but things stay the same, I think.
Yeah, completely. Whatever demographic you are, what you really want from news or any kind of analysis is interpretation. I think AI is definitely going to help that, but what we do in PR is ultimately about interpreting what's happening. And I think for that, you've got to have skill, you've got to experience, you've got to have a breadth of understanding. So fun enough, I feel very optimistic about the future of what we will do, because I think with AI, we still have this basic ability to interpret, and it doesn't matter what age you are, you need interpretation. So it makes me feel actually very positive in outlook terms about what we will do.
I think there was another question over here, Claire.
I was just wondering if you had a crisis that you've gone through that has lost you sleep, which I'm hopefully, but some of us have had, and what you might have done to have changed that now if you look back with expertise.
I think we've had that question a few times before, haven't we? I think we both said the same thing, which is too many to mention, which is a coward's way out, really. I mean, certainly when I was at number 10, it was a perpetual crisis. Not, I think, because Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, frankly, because that's what number 10 is like. And the interesting thing about that is you become inured to crises. So you wake up in the morning and a story is on every single front page and you skip into work thinking it's another day in the office. And I do think that's what I discovered, that the reason people are so petrified of crises is that, thank goodness, most people don't have to deal with them. But actually, if you live in an environment, a working environment, where everything is effectively some sort of crisis, first of all, you learn a lot, but secondly, you become inured to it. And that's a big risk, because if you become inured to crises, then your judgment gets affected. So, I mean, too many to mention, number 10, a few at the Palace, but it was just that sense of, this isn't real. This isn't what happens in most situations. People do not go from one crisis to another. So I guess I have a slightly that's influenced my view about crises in a way.
I remember Alistair Campbell said that when he was in Downing Street for about 10 years, I guess, it was a crisis every day, according to the Daily Mail or the Sun, but actually there was probably only about 3 crises over that 10 years that were actually, I think it was the fuel blockages, and also obviously the Iraq War was But, I suppose you grade it differently if you're in a higher pressure job.
And you measure how long effectively the crisis appears to be taking, and it's extraordinary often how quickly that caravan does move on.
The fuel crisis always makes me smile because the day that broke, Angie Hunter, who was Blair's right-hand woman, rang me as editor at the time and said, we just want to tell you that the fuel for because every Murdoch paper is delivered by truck, will be a priority. I never forgot that, because that was the
way of managing that crisis.
For very, very good PR, also I'm not quite sure about that. But the thing I found difficult to manage is the agency dynamic. So, for example, early on in Weber Shandwick, before I went to Brunswick, we were advised, no, it was Brunswick. Todd Stitzer was running Cadbury Schweppes, and the chocolate had salmonella in, and they had to close down the milky, the whole of the thing. I was out running, actually, and I got a call for some reason I had my phone with me, so I went straight in. But I found it very difficult to manage the dynamic. In other words, there's 7 people in the room. There's in-house, there's agency people. The CEO's, a guy called Todd Stitzer, is there. I've got an idea. How do I manage that dynamic? And I did it terribly. But I just basically didn't say anything and then got upset that no one had listened to me, but I hadn't said anything. I think for all of us, actually, finding the way to speak to power is really, really hard. I mean, I'm naturally quite shy, although I've been tabloid editor. I found it very difficult. So I would either be shouting at people or I would be saying nothing. And my team probably can say that's what you like now. But getting that right, and the people at the top of our game, Alan Parker, for example, Matthew Freud, that's what they're good at. They're really good at that. They've got this, I don't know what it is. They speak and everybody listens to them. So getting that right, if it's a tip for your careers, and I think there's 3 things I would say, is everyone's listening to what you say, so say something that adds value. I've never forgotten the CEO at that Cadbury Schweppes. I've forgotten her name now. I said, what do I do? What do I do? And she said, do something that adds value. Well, I think this is the communication director. What do you mean? But she's right. Do something that adds value and then shut up.
We have both been working separately on what we call the 20 golden rules of PR, which maybe one day will see the light of day. And it is interesting when you step back after long careers and what we do to just realise there are some golden rules. I mean, like another one for me is, and it's a very odd one, but it's true, the early bird catches the worm. We are in a business where actually starting early and getting ahead of the day and being in front of everything, of course it matters everywhere, but in what we do, it really matters. It really, really matters. And then, there's one which is a bit Dad's Army-like, but I think it's just true. Don't panic. I mean, the worst thing you can do in these situations is to panic, because panic, you're out of control. You've got to try and remain in control. There's another 18, but anyway, that's the kind of the gist of it.
Hi there. We had a session earlier talking about the rise of narrative crises and how difficult they are for brands to navigate, particularly when they're coordinated from niche platforms like Truth Social or Rumble. And I'm just wondering about the brands and the businesses that you're seeing and how they're tackling narrative crisis, and when is it worth doing something about?
When you say narrative crisis, you mean?
Where you see a coordinated effort to tell a untruth. I mean, obviously in political campaigning, it's happening a lot, but I think the example they gave was Arla and their cow and methane issue. It's an example of how a narrative is bubbling up but is being coordinated.
Last week we did a section on David Beckham and what's happened around Brooklyn not coming to the birthday party and basically getting smacked in the Sun and the Mail in this market is different now. It doesn't matter so much. I'm going to say the same thing about Gary Lineker tomorrow, and that is what I would say about that. Arla did get, but there was a time when that would finish. The CEO would be gone. So not
because they just don't have the circulation that they used to have?
It's because they don't have the circulation, but people are listening to, how many, I'd love to know within the Currys communications how much they would care if they had but people still people of our generation overreact to newspapers, so that's where that narrative is. That's where they want it. It's interesting, it starts on things like Truth Social, but they're aiming at particularly the Daily Mail because Daily Mail has such a big US following.
Yeah, I call it the Today programme mistake that people of a certain age, certain stage, assume that if something's not on the Today programme, everything's fine. And I think what we've got to work out, I remember at number 10, work out exactly to your point, that there's a whole different narrative out there that will never go anywhere near the Today programme, but could actually be much more damaging because the crucial thing is it's moving so fast. It's like a tsunami, and that really is the biggest challenge, I think, for all of us, that's just speed at which those kind of narratives develop and then become very difficult to manage.
Yeah, there is also the thing, is it true? If it's true, then you've got a problem. If it's not true, you haven't.
Have we got a final question?
My question, you've touched on it a little bit, but it's around bravery and values. And they shouldn't be, in my opinion, that shouldn't crumble when there is a change of administration or there is a wind of change that is not popular. If it's embedded in the company's values, it should be embedded in the values. Could we end on a positive note with recognising some brands or organisations that you think really get it right and stand by their values when it's not so popular?
Well, we've done a couple of items on Ben & Jerry, which obviously has had a checkered career within Unilever. But Ben & Jerry were very true to their principles from day one, so much so that when they would ring fence within the company and there was an attempt to force them to change what they were doing, they said, you know what, this ain't going to work, enough is enough. So I think that's I know it's a bit of a cliche, but that to me is a very good example of a company that says, we're prepared to stand up and go beyond just say no, we're actually prepared to change the way we're structured. But I'm afraid I do feel that a lot of companies, I do worry that the whole D&E agenda, the ESG agenda, is fundamentally being changed. I was on a call this morning, for instance, with an organisation involved in talking about Pride Week. The fact is that a lot of companies are no longer sponsoring Pride Weeks. End of. That's nothing to do with the case for Pride. It's to do with the feeling.
American companies or British
companies as well. It's happening. So even more important, those companies that do stand up do it pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ben & Jerry, Ben Cohen was arrested and dragged out the Senate hearing last week, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, shouting that they're not feeding the children in Gaza. That's corporate responsibility. But of course, he's retired. He sold the business and he goes back to his huge place in Vermont afterwards. But that is an example of corporate responsibility. The fact is, we can say Patagonia, M&S is showing at the moment that doing the right thing for a long time works because they're treading water, they're defying gravity. They're like Roadrunner, it goes over the edge of the cliff and is defeat. At some point they're going to drop because you can't get stuff. It is unbelievable. But that's an example of that. The fact is, the public know that business is about profit. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's what they know. So I'm afraid the mask has rather slipped quite a lot in the last 10 years, and I'm trying to find the positive. I think the positive way is I'm always struck when I go into the city and, that bankers are incredibly interesting people. They're incredibly interesting, highly educated, really literate, really interesting people. And 10, 15 years ago, they would have gone into politics. but they don't go into politics anymore because it's too easy. They don't go into politics because of the things like the MP's expenses, and it's easier to sit in Goldman's and make a lot of money, and that is just where we are, unfortunately, at the moment.
And end up very positive.
I was going to say,
well, it's very positive if you're at Goldman.
I'm going to end on a positive note and ask you...
You sound like Eve this every week. Can you just cheer us up, for God's sake, Yelland?
Has fame changed you? Are you now...
I don't think...
Are you now broadcast celebrities, or are you still PR guys?
Not recognised the street. My mother still says, what do you do? What do you actually... When are you going to get a proper job? When are you going to be like your brother? I mean, it's kind of...
You try and go in a coffee shop with the Today guys, with Amol or those guys, then you feel like enough.
You did a podcast with them, didn't you?
We did a mashup.
We've done, I'm doing one tomorrow, actually, but they're the famous people.
I do, this is a positive note, and sometimes when we're having a tough time in the studio, Eve will say, you know what, it's an incredible privilege to do this programme for the BBC.
It is.
And I sometimes take it is an incredible privilege. I didn't think that I'd be doing a programme at the BBC, maybe you didn't, David, either. And you just have to step back sometimes and say, actually, it doesn't matter about anything else. It's a privilege. And that's great.
It's about just doing the best job you can, and that's perhaps a positive thing, is I've learned over the years, just do the best job you can and it'll lead to something else. And I
actually also think it's a privilege to work in this industry as well, isn't it? Because
100%,
PR often talks itself down, but it's a growing industry, it's got growing in influence, and it's a great career now.
Well, look at the people out here, young, bright young people making their way in fantastic panels. I mean, PRWeek, when it first started, well, you got the first edition, haven't you? It was a kind of grotty old magazine that came out. Danny wasn't the editor, but it's just PRWeek itself has travelled so far. It's just extraordinary. So great compliments and kudos, Danny, to you and the team at PRWeek. That's a positive note, isn't it?
Yeah, that'll do. Yeah. Simon and David, thanks so much. Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed our special episode of the Fan Hitters Live from PR360. Keep checking out all our content about this fascinating comms business at prweek.co.uk. If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. But most importantly, do come back next time. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.